We are all here to see Mr. Douglas Ekman today to hear about the wonderful life story of the actor Pat Buttram. So without any further ado, let's have a big, nice round of applause for Mr. Douglas Ekman. Come on up, Doug.
Pat was an interesting guy. Pat was born in Alabama in 1915. His father was a minister, not a very prolific minister. He was one of those guys that traveled from little town to little town where they couldn't afford to have their own church. And Pat went off to college. He studied speech, but primarily his father's plan was for him to become a Methodist minister himself. He was christened Maxwell Emmett Buttram. 1915 was his birth date, and he died in 1994 of kidney failure in Los Angeles.
He was married to Dorothy McFadden in 1936.
They adopted a child. They lived together for 10 years as husband and wife. They divorced. For 6 years, he was pretty much single. Then he met Sheila Ryan, absolutely stunning, beautiful woman. She was a B-movie actress, and when we say B-movie actress, a B-movie wasn't necessarily bad quality. In fact, now when you look at that era, a lot of those B-movies were incredible. Actually, B-movies were the bread and butter of the film industry. The big-ticket items they often lost money on, but they filled in the gap with these B-movies. And Sheila Ryan did a number of those mysteries, murder mysteries, but she also did films with Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, several films, and also Laurel and Hardy. They ended up having one child between them, and they were married until her death in 1975. But there was no doubt, she was the love of his life. And when he spoke of her, he would get tears in his eyes constantly. Even in the 1980s, when I was working with him in the late 70s, he still would get very emotional about her because she was definitely the love of his life. He started off by accident. He left college, he went to Chicago, and there was a World's Fair here. WLS radio was out and about, and they were interviewing people in the crowd. He was this rube, and he looked like a rube, and he sounded like a rube. He had that Alabama accent and that voice, which he said, my voice never got out of puberty. And a lot of people thought he made that voice up. He didn't. That was his voice. But in Hollywood, later on, there was a place for him like Slim Pickens and Andy Devine, Fuzzy Q. Jones, people who had a great comedic ability but had funny voices. And that was Pat. I spent 16 years with Pat, and let me tell you, he couldn't have been on stage the whole time with me. That was his voice. Well, WLS hired him. He never went back to Alabama. He became one of the hosts of the WLS Barn Dance. It was a top-rated show, and there he met Gene Autry, the singing cowboy. And he was on that show for a number of years. This was the radio capital. This was incredible. Detroit had Sergeant Preston, the Lone Ranger, and the Green Hornet. This had Jack Armstrong, All-American Boy, Corliss Archer. It had so many great shows. Fibber McGee and Molly. They lived in a penthouse on Wabash between Superior and Huron. Pat Buttram had the whole top floor of the St. Clair Hotel, which is still there on Ontario and St. Clair. He became a big star in Chicago, and he was a very, very, very talented guy. And he could do many things. He was not the rube that he pretended to be. Later in life, he got an Emmy for being in a Hitchcock serial. He did 2, I think, television shows. This was not a dumb person. He wrote most of his material for Green Acres. He wrote for Hee Haw, and he also wrote all of the shtick that he did when he was in movies with Gene Autry. Well, here we are now in Denver. We're going to do a personal appearance at Spedding Chevrolet, and we went over there, and when we pulled up, I couldn't believe. The line stretched from the showroom out into the parking lot and snaked around. Later in life, I did things with Dick Biondi and Sven Gulli, and they had big audiences, but nothing like Pat Buttram and Mr. Haney. And he gave all of them time, 5, 10 minutes. We were there for several hours. And there was a woman who came up to us, and she was a nice old woman. I think I'm older than she was then, but a nice old woman, and she had this concern on her face. And Pat said, "You look awfully perplexed. What's the problem?" She said, "Well, whatever happened to Arnold?" Arnold the pig. If you ever saw that show, Arnold was this little pet pig, a baby pig. And he said, "Well, we did that show for 6.5 years. We had lots of Arnolds. You know, they grew up to be fat pigs, and we had to change them from time to time." She said, "Well, what happened to the old Arnold each time?" "Oh, well, don't you worry about that. The trainer had a ranch out there in the valley, and when the previous Arnold was decommissioned, he was replaced. They went and lived on that ranch. A life of luxury. You don't have to worry about that pig, really." Oh, I'm so happy. I was so worried. Well, she left us. Pat turned to me and go, "Hell, we used to barbecue them pigs right on the set." Well, he didn't. But Pat would never pass up an opportunity to do a humorous moment. He worked with Castor. Castor changed the whole industry. He put products into movies. If you saw Jerry Lewis, a Coca-Cola bottle or whatever it was Joe Castor that put it there, and he got paid big money to get it there. There's a restaurant, was on Sunset, called the Cock and Bull. The Cock and Bull is where almost every actor who was out of work, or producer, director, or anyone would hang out. There you could get work. Deals were done at the Cock and Bull. Later they opened one, the Tail of the Cock, which was out in the valley. Well, business happened there. Colonel Joe Castor found out that they were going to make a movie with Doris Day, and she was the biggest thing in Hollywood at that moment. And in that movie, Please Don't Eat the Daisies, there was going to be a scene where they needed a moving truck. It was going to be on screen all across America with probably what would be the #1 movie. He went to the Cock and Bull, sat down with 2 of the writers for the film, said, "What would it take to get that truck to be a Mayflower moving van?" It took $10,000 to each writer. He then went to Mayflower and said, "What it would be worth to you to have your trucks literally on the screen of the #1 movie in America that's going to be for the next year or year and a half. What would that be worth to you?" Well, the figure they came up with was $100,000. So Colonel Joe Castor put $80,000 in his pocket and gave $10,000 to each writer. He was so good at doing that they legislated against him. And that's when he found Pat Buttram. And that's how I got to work with him. Over the years, he was I hate to use the term inspirational, but when you're around a guy like that and you only know him in one dimension as Mr. Haney or as this sidekick, you find out the depth of some of the people like that. We spent some marvelous times together. They were usually in bars or restaurants or airports. Pat was an alcoholic. And that came to an end. One time he passed out in a shower, and he hit the handle as he fell to the floor, and it went all the way over to hot. It scalded his fingers, and he lost parts of two of them. He took the cure from that moment on. He didn't have a drink ever. He would order, as he said, sarsaparilla, and those were terms that he used over and over again. And so there was so often that the Mr. Haney character sometimes bled into who Pat Buttram was. Going back to that personal appearance, the dealer said to me, "Tell that old man that he has to be here till 7 o'clock. I said, "Well, he can't. He's got a charity he has to go to," because Pat had said, "Tell him I got to get out here at 5 o'clock. I'm doing a charity." And I said, it's for muscular dystrophy, I think. Well, he marched right out into that showroom, grabbed Pat, said, "What's this I hear about you have to leave here at 5 o'clock? Well, I'm doing a charity. I do a lot of that stuff. I think I'm doing it for March of Dimes." Said, "I thought it was muscular dystrophy." "Oh, I do so many of these that I can't get them straight." Well, we left at 5 o'clock, and he gave him all his money's worth. That was for sure. But what Pat didn't know is that when he flew back to California, Gene Autry called him up. Years earlier, he had beckoned him in Chicago to come to L.A. and be in movies with him. Well, he actually auditioned for Roy Rogers first. He didn't get it. He got turned down. But Gene said, "You're going to be my guy." And he and Gene were like this forever after that. Well, that day he went to what was Great West, I think, John, that he owned in those days, a big radio syndicate. Autry made a ton of money in radio. He became much more rich, lucrative in the broadcast business than he was in films. And when Pat got there, Gene presented him with a check. Pat said, "This is for $100,000. I can't believe this. That's $150,000. You can't do that, Gene." Pat to Gene said, "You do all of this charity work for me, and you never charge a penny. Take this. This is not out of my pocket. This is a corporation now. It's not my money." Pat said, "It's not your money?" He said, "No, it's the corporation." "Well, then why don't we make it $200,000? Now, Pat might have been joking, but I got a feeling that the next time a check came by, it was probably for a couple $100,000. The two of them would still get together. Gene was as much of a drinker as Pat was, and Pat would drink sarsaparilla, and Gene would drink the hard stuff. Whether it was the Brown Derby or Chasen's or Musso and Frank's or the Cock and Bull, they would go and have lunch with other cronies there, George Burns and people like that. And he had a chauffeur, Autry did, named Robert. And Robert would get them in a booth or a table, and he'd situate himself at the bar and have a clean view of Gene and Pat and whoever's at the table. He knew when to walk over to the table. After a couple hours, he'd walk over and say, Mr. Autry, don't forget, you wanted me to remind you that there's a meeting this afternoon, appointment you have to make, remember, 3 o'clock. Oh, yes, Robert, that's what Gene said. Pat and Robert no sooner would get them in the car. Pat would say, we got him in the back seat of that car. He'd pass out. Robert knew exactly. It was like magic. He knew exactly when to tell Gene, Gene, we've got to go. Well, Gene knew enough in those days that he knew to listen to Robert. But everybody drank in Hollywood in those days. I mean, that's what they did. Everyone had a cocktail. I mean, and nobody talked about it. You know, Pat would say, we don't gossip about people. You know, we didn't care who they were sleeping with or what they were sleeping with. We didn't care. We didn't talk about those things. He said, you know, but we knew people who were drinking. I said, well, what about Buddy Ebsen? Buddy Ebsen of the Beverly Hillbillies. And before that, he was the dance partner to Shirley Temple early on in those films. And I'd always heard stories that Buddy was a one-drink person. That was it. He goes, well, let me tell you how that happened. He said he'd go into the Cock and Bull, and they had a 2-drink limit, much like this, but you got a free buffet. And that's why all these out-of-work people went there. They get 2 drinks, pay for them, but they got to eat instead, okay? Well, that was the difference. He said, and Buddy would go in there, he'd sit at the bar, he'd have 1 drink, and the bartender would say, well, Mr. Ebsen, you want your second drink now? No, no, Pat said he would say, I'm just having 1 drink, and that's it. I'm working, you know. Oh, okay. Mr. Ebsen would then leave the Cock and Bull, and he'd go down to Musso and Frank's. When it came time for a second drink, no, no, as Pat would say, just 1 drink, that's all I take. Pat said he'd do that about 6 or 7 times until he made it out into the valley. Hell, he was so oiled by the time he got there. We all knew it, but as far as we were concerned, he had only 1 drink. That was it. You know, we knew a lot about people, he said, but we didn't talk. He said, George Burns used to always say that he credited a young lady who used to visit him once a week for his longevity after Gracie died. Trust me, she wasn't reading to him. Said, but we never talked about it. We knew what was going on between her and George, but it was just the way it was. It was the way the business would be. Well, one other time, we were at the Brown Palace. We were sitting in a bar, which was a nautical theme. It's still there, and it's a. You ever get to Denver, if you've never been to this hotel, you just need to go in and walk around and look at it. It's just a great place. And we would sit there, he'd drink his sarsaparilla, and I'd have a few cocktails. And I said to him one day, because I would pick his brain all the time, I wanted to do that. He had so many great stories, and I'd get him rolling, you know. He goes, I know what you're doing. You're just getting me to tell these secrets. I go, someday you'll take it and put it in a book. You'll make money off it. I'll be dead staring at the coffin. I said, no, it's just entertaining, Pat. I have a question, though. Slim Pickens, the actor, were you two friends? Oh, I should say not. No. The trouble with Slim was he thought he was me, and he wasn't very good at it. I found out later that he and Slim were really up for the same roles often. So there was a great competition between them and Andy Devine and people like that in that business at that time. And he said, what I really get angry about, so many times someone comes up to me and they say, oh, Mr. Buttram, we've enjoyed your acting so much. We just love you. And we love you especially in that movie you did in Dr. Strangelove, where you rode that bomb all the way down. Pat would look at me, look at him, and he'd go, that wasn't me, that was Slim Pickens, gritting his teeth. 5 minutes later, absolute true story. 5 minutes later, some guy walks in, about 6'5". He's wearing one of those suits you used to see out of Nashville and country western singers. Very expensive, all embroidered, and had a big 10-gallon hat on. And it just so happened that it was the cattle show, the yearly cattle show in Denver. And cattlemen came from literally all over the West. People up here in the Midwest, even though, we had the stockyards, weren't too acquainted with what went on out west out there. But anyway, this guy comes up, and the first thing he shouts out in the saloon, oh my God, it's Pat Buttram. Well, Pat, he didn't mind the spotlight. He's smiling, and people are applauding him, and hey, Pat, and going on. He goes, Pat, you will not believe who I was hunting hogs with last week in Arkansas. Slim Pickens. Pat looks at me and looks at him and said, oh, yeah, Slim and I go back a long way. Well, later that night, I and Pat were in a lounge area after having dinner, and I went to the restroom. It was a pretty young lady, really attractive. And she comes up to me and she said, that gentleman you're with, is that Pat Buttram, Mr. Haney? I said, yes, it is. That's Mr. Haney, Pat Buttram. She said, oh my God, I thought that was him. I said, would you like to join us for a drink? Could I? Sure, come on. And Pat was very charming. He liked pretty ladies. And she sat with us, and from time to time she would leave the table. And one time I followed her, and she went to a payphone. This was before cell phones. She went to a payphone, and she had a little book. And she would call, and she would write things in that little book. Well, I got back to the table before she did, and Pat looked at me and said, I'm a pretty good judge of character. I think we got a working girl here. That's what I think. I said, I think you could be right, Pat. I think you could be right. He said, you watch her when she comes back. If she's got any white powder on her nose, out of here. If Disney found out I was with a hooker doing cocaine, I'd never do a cartoon again. And a lot of people don't realize that he probably made more money doing cartoon voices, Hillbilly Dog, and a lot of others over the years, and half of those cartoon writers were former screenwriters. Well, Pat had lots of great friends out in Hollywood, and they used to meet together, and they would hang out at the Beverly Hills, Wilshire. Errol Flynn was one of his closest friends. David Niven, who was a big star at that time. George Burns would come by. And there was some lesser names. They'd all hang, and Charlie, who was the manager of the hotel, kept them over in a corner out of the way. They had practical jokes they would pull. And he put up with them because of who they were. Well, they were a great lot. And Errol Flynn was sort of the leader of the group. He eventually brought in John Barrymore. John Barrymore had become a really hard-to-employ actor. He had crawled into the bottle. And if you ever saw a movie, Breakfast at 8, with Jean Harlow and Wallace Beery, that's pretty much his story. The character he plays in that film commits suicide. He's no longer invited to, not only to try out for a film or to be given a script, he's not even invited to any parties. He was persona non grata. Errol Flynn looked upon him almost as a father. He invited him to come and live in a bedroom on the second floor of Flynn's mansion. And one time, a guy that was changing windows and doing work for Flynn came to Flynn and said, "Mr. Flynn, we got a problem with the room that Mr. Barrymore's in. All the windowsills and the windows are rotted, and we're going to have to replace everything." Well, it appeared, though, once John Barrymore came to his house, he didn't stop drinking. And the restroom down the hall was a little too far to go. So he'd throw open a window and do his business right there. He put up with Barrymore because he loved him and he idolized him. But that didn't stop this group from doing their practical jokes. This has been denied by a few people in Hollywood. Pat absolutely guaranteed. He told me, he said, once Barrymore died and he was in the mortuary, we went over there and we stole his body. And we took it to Flynn's house. We propped him up in a chair, put a drink in one hand and a cigarette by the other. And when Errol came home, he was grief-stricken, of course. He went into his study to get a drink, and there was John Barrymore having a drink, now dead, in his study. Well, Flynn ran out screaming, but they didn't. Sky was the limit. These jokes went on forever. Charlie, the manager, had to deal with Shorty, a homeless guy. In those days, you'd call him a stumblebum. And Shorty would get drunk and he'd come into the lobby of the Beverly Hills Wilshire and he'd grab a chair over in the corner and he'd fall asleep. And Charlie was constantly throwing him out. Well, it got to a point where Charlie decided to leave Hollywood. Charlie took a job of all places, the Brown Palace in Denver. His last day was Friday, his first day was Monday. What happened was they took Shorty, cleaned him up, got him a suit, bought him a ticket to Denver and booked him at the Brown Palace. So the day that he walked in, when Charlie walked in his first day, Shorty was there to say, "Welcome to the Brown Palace, Shorty." Now, they didn't see it, but that was enough for them. They could laugh about it, and again, they were constantly doing this to everybody that they worked with. And they were the kind of people that forgave. It was funny, even though they might have been the blunt of the joke, they forgave each other for doing it. Pat was the kind of guy that, when I worked with him, he wrote most of all of his own stuff. But as I said earlier, I would get jokes to him on occasion, and he would look at them, and sometimes he would laugh, and I think sometimes he used them, but he would never use them around me. And once a comedian or a person of his stature used it, it was his. simply because of who they were. When I was doing little clubs like this in the 60s, you could smell usually patchouli and grass, marijuana. Audience was made up of hippies and wannabe hippies. And I would always start my show with, before we get going, I'd like to do a little survey here. How many young ladies in this audience have a rosebud tattoo on their breast? Well, I was always surprised how many hands went up. I said, well, don't worry, because in a few years, you'll have a long stem rose. Well, I pretty much gave that to Pat, and he laughed at that. He thought that was a fairly funny joke to do, but that was it. He really did all of his own material, and we never had to worry about him taking license. If I brought up a joke, it was his. It was his from that moment on. But we had direction from higher places. Pat and I would talk once a week. I got a phone call one day. He said, Ronnie called me. Ronnie was Ronald Reagan. You know, he's going to do this presidential debate with Jimmy Carter, and he wants us to come up with a couple jokes that can sort of lighten the load a little bit. Well, we wrote about 5 jokes between us back and forth. Pat did probably the majority of it, but I would put a line in here or there, and he'd give me a backhanded compliment that said, "You sure you came up with this?" I go, "Yes, it's mine, Pat." The 3 jokes, which now I have had fed back to me. That's what's interesting. When you're a comedy writer, when you come up with a joke or an idea, and all of a sudden, months, years later, someone tells you that joke, as though it's their joke, and you just smile and laugh. 3 of those jokes I heard just in the last election here. They reminded everybody of Reagan doing that, you know? So, you know, maybe I didn't make Saturday Night Live's crew, but a future president of the United States liked it. The 3 jokes were this. Best, the way Pat delivered them. Isn't it interesting that there's only 3 places in the world today where communism thrives? Cuba, China, and Beverly Hills. A second joke, which then was not that controversial, although Reagan was a right-to-lifer, it's more controversial today. And it was this, and this was pretty much Pat's joke. Isn't it interesting that everyone who's for abortion is here already? And then he'd give you that look over his glasses. And the final one that he did was one that we had talked about time and time again, but that was, it's a recession when your neighbor's out of work. It's a depression when you're out of work.
And recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his.
And that was fed back to me by network news just this last election. And it is interesting, you know, when you knew you were there for the birth of these jokes, and now some commentator, some 40 years later, is giving them to you, and Pat or I never got credit. Ronald Reagan got credit for them. Well, I'm not saying that worked, but he ended up being president. And when you write for people like that, it's a great deal of pleasure. if it does come back to you, you know, you become part of the lexicon. You become part of life. When you get close to people like a guy like Pat Buttram or stars in the business, you have to take a position not of being equal, but you're in the business. All the people I've worked with, I think I have one photo with a celebrity. Because I felt if I asked for a photo with them, I was now at the fan level. I wasn't on the same level as they were working. I hate myself for it now, because a lot of those people are dead or they're who knows where, but they would have brought back some great memories. But I never, ever crossed that line. My crews did constantly. They were always having photos taken with them. But we had a personal relationship, a friendship. And one time he said to me when he called me, he said, why don't you and Maggie come with Angie and I to London? We're going to go over there for a week. I said, Angie? Angie? He said, Angie Dickinson. Who do you think I'm talking about? I said, you and Angie Dickinson. Oh, you think she wouldn't look at an old man like me? Well, let me tell you something, son. She calls me Mr. Buttram, and she loves me. I know. She's had a lot of suitors in Hollywood over the years. She's got a heart of gold and a body of a 25-year-old. They wanted us to come, Maggie and I. And he said, Angie and Maggie can go out and spend our money, and I can sit in the Dorchester with you, and I'll tell you more stories. I said, well, wouldn't that be great? Well, I passed up. Something came along. I couldn't do it. Another time he said, I want you and Maggie to come out to L.A. and be at a dinner party I'm having. Well, I was doing a big top buy-a-thon in Davenport. That's how I was getting paid for doing that. I gave up going to a dinner party in Hollywood with a star-studded cast that included Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, Jimmy Stewart, his wife, George Burns, and several other actors. And now all of them are dead. I chose to do a big top buy-a-thon, and but that was my job. And I went off to do it. But those are the kind of things that you're faced with, that you have to make those kind of decisions. You have to decide what is business and what isn't business. And we did a ton of business, Pat and I. I had him fly into Chicago. We're doing a GMC truck commercial, and I rented a farm out 131 Expressway. And I called up Pat at the hotel here in Chicago, and I said, Pat, you have to understand, I don't have a big budget for this production. I don't. I've used the majority of the budget for you, for your fee, but I've had to cut some things. Well, like what? What did you cut? I said, well, I cut your trailer. You cut my trailer? How am I going to put my Mr. Haney outfit on? And there's no trailer. I said, well, there's a Shell station just off of 131. Wait a minute. You're asking a big Hollywood star like me to go into a crapper of a Shell station and put on my Mr. Haney outfit? I can just see it now. Some guy comes in there to take a whiz, sees me in there putting on my Mr. Haney outfit. He goes home and tells his wife and his kids, you won't believe it, Pat Buttram is homeless, and he's living in a Shell station off of 131. What you've done to my career. I can't believe I let you even do these things. Well, he gave me a lot of static over the years, but he would give me a backhanded compliment. When I would give him a script and he actually liked it, he would say that line, "Are you sure you wrote this? Are you absolutely sure you wrote this?" And I would have to say, yes, of course I wrote it. Well, I felt that he eventually developed a deal of respect and camaraderie, and we really became friends. His audience, too, was so varied. He was on a show that took place somewhere in the South. Hooterville, as it was called, was a makeup town. It was a southern town. And there was not one black actor or black character in that show. And I asked him, when I was in the agency business and I would look at demographics, I would see lots of African American people who watched this show and the Andy Griffith Show, Mayberry. And Pat said to me, "You know, I wondered about that." So he said, I talked to Andy once, and Andy had a theory. Andy said, even though life was not great in the South at that time for black people, they left little towns like Hooterville and Mayberry to go up north and get better paying jobs in Detroit and Chicago. But they still had a kind of fondness for the way of life that existed there and sort of totally blacked out the bad times that was there. Not definitive research, but a couple very smart guys. And that was reinforced to me once when we were in Philadelphia. And we got to the airport, and a skycap, who happened to be black, came out and got our bags from the taxi. And as we were walking to the terminal, his name was John, by the way, John put his hand over his mouth, said to me, "Isn't that Mr. Haney? That's Mr. Haney, isn't it?" And I said, "Well, that's Pat Buttram. He played Mr. Haney in Green Acres, and he's a humorist. He's a comedian. He's an actor." I thought that was Mr. Haney. I thought that's who that was. So we got farther in, and he got up by Pat, and I saw him again put his hand over his mouth, and he leaned over to Pat, and he said something to him. And I got into the terminal with Pat, and I walked up by him, and I said, "What did John, the skycap, say to you, Pat?" He said, "You still screwing that old white man out of money?" We got inside the terminal, and he turned around, he looked at John and I, John the skycap, and he said to him, "We're going to the Admirals Club, and we'll want you to come in there, John." Well, we got up front, and the young girl said, "Mr. Buttram, we've been expecting you." He said, "Well, that's fine, because we all want to get some refreshment, and that includes John. Is there a problem with that?" He said, "Not if there's not a problem with you, Mr. Haney, and if that's what you wish." That is what I wish. Come on, boys, let's go have something to drink. And I think that really told you what kind of person Pat was. He was an incredibly wonderful, wonderful man. We were shooting a commercial on Armitage and Halstead, and he was going to take a break at the end of the day. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was going to go visit an old girlfriend that he had and just see her. I said, well, fine, go have fun. The next day on the set, he said to me, you know, I had a good time. I said, well, where did she live? She lived $67.67 from here. He said, we shared old moments. We did a little smooching. Got to understand, smooching encompassed everything, from hand-holding to the act. If he was smooching, said, we were nice to each other and took off as little as possible. Well, Pat and I went through some tough moments. We both had cancer together, and we talked each other up quite a bit, and we cheered each other on days, and we were good for each other. And that friendship just grew. And the death of the news of his death came in a terrible way. For all of you people in broadcast, at the end of a newscast, they always say, and finally in the news, and they do a little human interest story. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's tear-jerking. I'm driving down the freeway. I'm listening to CBS Radio News. The announcer says at the end of the newscast, and finally in the news today, comedian and actor Pat Buttram died of kidney failure at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. Well, I pulled the car over, put my head on the steering wheel, and I'm not ashamed to say I shed a few tears. Terrible way to get the news about someone who was so dear to me and to so many people. Really made my final phone call with him even more important. We were talking each other up, getting through cancer, and there was silence for a moment, and I thought it was disconnected. And I said, Pat, are you still there? And then I heard, I love you, Doug. I said, I love you too, Pat. And I love you guys for coming to share this moment, because I know Mr. Buttram has the best seat in the house in heaven. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Very, very interesting. Excellent start.